So yeah, thank you so much. And I'm really excited to be with you. And so yeah, just talking today a bit more about the ongoing threat of Christian nationalism to democracy. So in Taking America Back for God, which came out in 2020, right as the pandemic was starting in March. And so it's been a bit of a whirlwind since then. But we finished writing it in 2019. And so a lot of what we were responding to was the beginning of the Trump administration here in the US. And obviously that's part of a larger, global movement of, populism, anti-democratic movements elsewhere. But this work focuses in the United States, but again, I know as part of a larger move here. And so one of the really key watershed moments, even after obviously the book came out, was the 2020 election, but the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. And so this was in response to misleading and false information about the election being stolen. Trump spoke earlier that day on the National Mall and essentially directed his followers and those there to go to the Capitol as Congress was going to certify the 2020 election, those results. And so some of you might have watched this unfold. I know that I was, again, this was the height of COVID, so I was at home, but watching it on live TV and on social media, just tracking what exactly is taking place. And it was one of those moments where you knew something historic was happening and this is different. This is kind of a switch and a change. But after the insurrection, as during that day and then the weeks after, we started to see pictures and accounts take place of what happened there. And later in July, as Congress was inviting police officers to come and share their experiences of what happened at Congress that day, one officer, Daniel Hodges, recounted how those that were amassed on the West Terrace, they brandished different banners with a Christian symbolism, like you can see here, a Christian flag and Jesus is King. And he was saying that the terrorists perceived themselves as Christians. So he saw the Christian flag flying, saw a flag saying, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. And he described one insurrectionist that wore a shirt, God, guns, and Trump. And so not only witnessing the violence that day of those that were storming the Capitol, but he himself endured that violence. So I don't know if some of you saw video accounts of that day, but he was the officer stuck between the door as the mass of people were trying to break in, and he was crying out in pain. But comfortably intermingled with Christian symbolism that day were flags and symbols of white supremacy, which again has a long history here in the US, and then the conspiracy theory of QAnon. The Confederate battle flag flew in Congress that day. And the insurrectionists, as they were filming themselves in their social media accounts and uploading those videos, were personally understanding what they were doing in terms of saving their country, and that God has given them this country, and that they were being called to do what they could to bring the country back to what God has designed. And so not only in the symbols that they flew and carried, in their own words, understood what they were doing as part of their Christian faith and saving this country as they saw it. And so as an explicit attack on democracy and the democratic norms, understanding what they were doing, again, that democracy, if it stands in the way of what they perceive the Christian God desires for their country, they were willing to set that aside. And so again, this was a very real moment, a watershed moment for understanding for this group of individuals, what is the United States? How do we identify it? What does it mean? And so as we look at the US and we saw those videos and symbols of that day, we saw Christian nationalism at work. And so really key to our work is providing an empirical definition of what Christian nationalism is and then how we measure it. And so again, this definition has come through a number of peer-reviewed studies and in our book. And it's interesting in this moment in the US because some on the political and religious right are trying to take that term Christian nationalism and redefine it, make it mean something different, or to say, well, nobody is, has really described it. We don't really know what this means. And so there's a part of it that this term is under contestation. But really, with our work and with my work, we're providing an empirical, clear definition. And so we're really trying to highlight this more and more and help folks understand it, especially in the US. But Christian nationalism, we define it as a cultural framework. So this is a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, value systems that idealize and advocate for a fusion of a particular expression of Christianity, because again, there are many expressions of Christianity globally and in the US. But this is focused on a very particular type, fusing that with American civic life. So it holds that the United States and this version of Christianity were really tightly intertwined, and that this particular expression of Christianity should be the principal and undisputed cultural framework in the US, and that the government should take steps to formally recognize it and defend it. But beyond any theological or orthodox beliefs of the historic Christian faith, this particular expression of Christianity really has less to do with those and is really more about a conservative, ethnocultural, political orientation. So it really is a political theology of a very particular expression of Christianity. And we've found over and over through different empirical studies that it contains four kind of key elements. And I'll run through these quickly and then start to show you how this is associated with anti-democratic values in the US. So the first element is a strong sense of moral traditionalism, and the idea that society should be and is based around strict hierarchies. These often revolve around gender and sexuality. So there are people at the top, people in the middle, and people at the bottom of these hierarchies. And that is the way that it is designed, should be designed, that God desires. The second element is a comfort with authoritarian social control. So they see the world as a chaotic place, and we need strong moral order. We need strong rulers and strong rules to impose order on that chaos. And so there is a comfort with authoritarianism. The third is a desire for strict ethno-racial boundaries. And this is intimately intertwined with the history of the US as a place that from the very first Europeans landing here, creating strong boundaries around who they were over and above and against the indigenous populations that they encountered on these shores, from the slaves that they brought to these shores. And so this understanding that a Christian nation really is where white natural born citizens are again at the top of this hierarchy with everyone else coming after. And then finally, a strong populist impulse. And really that inclines Americans in the way that it operates here towards, excuse me, feelings of victimization, conspiratorial thinking, suspicion towards elites as they define them, which would be academics like myself and us, politicians, mainstream media, and again, seeing all these groups as over and against what true America is. Now, how do we measure Christian nationalism? This is how we've defined it. One way, key way that we do in the book, Taking America Back for God, is to ask a series of questions to our survey respondents, and they can strongly disagree to strongly agree with these questions. And then we assign a point value to each one. So if they strongly disagree, they would get a 0. If they strongly agree, they would get a 4. And then we're able to add these together to create a scale of Christian nationalism. So this is another key point when we're talking about Christian nationalism here in the US, and I think religious nationalism elsewhere. It really is a spectrum. It isn't a binary either or, right? You're either a Christian nationalist or you're not. But that we see Americans that maybe are more, they strongly embrace it, or they lean that way, think that there's some good, of this idea of Christianity being a key cultural framework. Others that resist that, or Americans that reject it. So the questions we ask are things like the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation, or the federal government should advocate Christian values. And when we add all these up, we can see that Americans, and this is data collected in 2021, fall at different points on this scale. So you see a number of Americans score a 0 on this scale, meaning they strongly disagree with all those questions. We see Americans at the upper end of the scale, fewer strongly agree with every single question. But most Americans find themselves in the middle, right? Where there's a sense of accommodation towards Christian nationalism or resisting it somewhat. But again, there isn't a binary. But what we find is that it matters that there's this essentially normal distribution that people are in the middle. Now, to ease discussion, we break this scale into 4 different groups. And you can see with the different colors highlighted here, I'm going to group these together. And we assign names, and this is really a heuristic device to just make it easier to talk about where Americans fall on this scale. So we have rejectors and resistors. So they're on the lower half of the scale. They're about a quarter of the population each. So a little over half of Americans are at least skeptical or outright rejecting of Christian nationalism. They don't want to see it, this version of Christianity, ascendant in the public sphere or guiding all our political discussions. We see about a third of Americans are accommodators. And so these are folks that their support of Christian nationalism is undeniable, but it isn't comprehensive. And so when we interview Americans who are accommodators, they'll say things like, Christianity obviously played a key role in the founding of the United States. I think Christianity offers, positive values. And so it should have a place in the public sphere. Now, it shouldn't be the only religion, but if we're going to have a prayer at a sporting event on a Friday night at a school, it might as well be Christian. Right. So that's kind of how our accommodators see Christianity and its central place. It shouldn't be the only voice, but it's been a key part of the US. We should just keep it that way. And then we have ambassadors, and these are our true believers. And this is consistently the smallest group of Americans, about 16% are ambassadors of Christian nationalism. And so they're wholly supportive of this idea that Christianity, as they define it, again, this particular expression, should be the one and only key cultural framework. It should guide our policy discussions. The government should defend the ascendancy of this version of Christianity, all of those things. Now, with these 4 groups, how does it connect to anti-democratic values? Well, when we look at the insurrection broadly, Christian nationalism provided what I think as theological cover for what many of the folks that were at the Capitol were doing that day. Now, we did not gather data from those at the Capitol that day. The data that I'm going to share with you is of the American public. But what we're going to see and what I'm going to show is that the values and beliefs that we see spread across the American public were a part of how those at the Capitol were understanding what they were doing, again, through their own words. And so while only a couple thousand Americans actually traveled to DC and attacked the Capitol, they went back to communities and congregations of people that saw the world like them, that were essentially supportive of this idea. Now, most Americans wouldn't go attack the Capitol, but would they agree that, hey, this country is going kind of away from the way that it should, and we need to do something? We're going to see that's a yes. And so I'm going to share 2 quotes to highlight this theological cover that Christian nationalism provides. So with this first quote, this person said, "I think God brought him, Trump, here for a season, for these 4 years. I'm just asking that God would spare this country for another 4 years to give us a little bit more time to do the work before the storm hits. I believe the storm is coming. You're going to see Christians attacked. You're going to see churches close. You're going to see a real hatred expressed towards people of faith. That's coming. God uses men. He works through men. And I believe Donald Trump is the president for a reason. I think God has put him in this position. Western civilization, as we have known it, he is defending that." Now consider this quote. "Trump will be your president 4 more years in Jesus' name. We're getting ready to live through something of biblical proportions. Be prayed up and be ready to defend your country and your family. Now, this first quote is from Franklin Graham. So for those of you who track Christianity in the United States or its history, Franklin Graham is the son of Billy Graham, who's probably the most famous evangelist of the 20th century. And Franklin Graham is the CEO of two very large global evangelical organizations, Evangelistic Association, the Billy Graham Association, and then Samaritan's Purse. So very large corporations. The second is from Michael Sparks, who was an insurrectionist. He was actually one of the first people who were charged with the insurrection and causing the violence at the Capitol. And so we can see that these large influential evangelical leaders, what they were saying and what they were thinking after the election leading up to the insurrection, really was in lockstep with the people that actually went to the Capitol and did what they did that day. And so Christian nationalism, again, provides this theological cover that, hey, this is what God has desired for this country. And so whatever we have to do to take this country back, that is okay. Because again, who should go against the will of the Christian God if this is what the Christian God wants? But not only does it provide theological cover, it actually provides and overlaps with a number of different elements that we saw on that day on January 6th. And all these elements are mutually reinforcing. So the first element is Christian nationalism and the big lie. So the big lie is that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump. Again, there's no evidence of that. But when we asked Americans to strongly disagree with the question, the 2020 presidential election was rigged and its outcome did not reflect the will of the people. So again, this is the big lie. We see that Christian nationalism is intimately intertwined with this element. So 2/3 of ambassadors agree or strongly agree with the big lie. So again, embracing Christian nationalism, intimately associated with, again, believing that the 2020 election was stolen. When we look at political violence, a second element that we see happening there on January 6th, we see that data from just before or just after the insurrection, we asked Americans to agree with the statement, true American patriots may have to resort to physical violence in order to save our country. We see 40% of ambassadors agree or strongly agree with enacting political violence in order to save their country. About 20% of accommodators, so it goes down obviously from there. But again, we see a comfort with political violence if indeed those enacting it felt like we have to do this to save the country. We asked another question. There is a storm coming that will soon sweep away elites in power and restore rightful leaders. We see almost half of ambassadors believe that, again, there's a storm coming, sweep away elites to restore rightful leaders. And so with both of these, the big lie, the first element, political violence, we see Christian nationalism intimately intertwined with that. And so when we think of the Capitol insurrection, the big lie brought many people there. And then the will to move and break into the Capitol and attack the Capitol, again, is intimately intertwined with political violence. Now, the third element that we see taking place there on the January 6th insurrection really highlights this one part of this question. So if anyone on the call has read about or has any knowledge of QAnon, the conspiracy theory, you'll see that this little phrase, the storm coming soon, is a key phrase that pops up over and over within QAnon. And so this prediction that these elites in power are going to be swept away and the country will be returned to the leader, that was a part of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And we see that Christian nationalism is intertwined with more conspiratorial thinking, and especially with QAnon, when we ask questions about QAnon specifically, and all of those played a role in the insurrection. So one of the key beliefs of QAnon is that top Democrats are involved in elite child sex trafficking rings. And when we ask Americans, again, this is not of the people that were at the Capitol, kind of the most true believers. This is of National Survey of Americans. We see that 40% of ambassadors agree or strongly agree with one of the key elements of the QAnon conspiracy theory. Again, that number goes down dramatically for accommodators, but again, with the seriousness of this type of question and believing in that conspiracy theory specifically, we see that Christian nationalism is a key part of that. And again, at the Capitol, we see signs of QAnon there as well. And in more recent data, PRI did a national survey of Americans just earlier this year, and 30% of the folks who are sympathetic to Christian nationalism agreed with a number of elements of the QAnon conspiracy theory. And so this is a key part of what we see taking place there. Now, a final element, and one of the biggest hurdles that historians highlight here in the US since the 70s is a fractured media landscape where Americans can kind of go to a political or a particular news source that essentially functions as an echo chamber, where they're able to select into, I'm going to hear what I want to hear from this news. And so it really is difficult for there to be kind of a shared reality. These different news organizations are able to and do provide viewpoints that, again, reinforce what folks essentially want to hear. Now, Robert Jeffress is a megachurch pastor in Dallas. And at a Christmas service, he put up this particular slide as they invited Trump to actually come and speak that morning. But he was telling his online viewers and those in his congregation, hey, I'm going to be on Fox these different times and days. So if you want to catch me on Fox, here's where you can see that. And so he is a major proponent of Christian nationalism in the US. And so this underscores that he knows who he's speaking to and he knows where his congregants go for news, right? And he's on those different news sources. And so when we look at where Americans go for news, who they trust for news, this final element shows that across the different types of embrace of Christian nationalism, ambassadors are much more likely to go to or watch Fox News. And it's a pretty linear relationship from there. When we look at what we could call the big kind of news organizations, ABC, CBS, NBC News, there is more of an even distribution there across the different Christian nationalism groups. But one of the interesting parts of news in the US is that these large major news organizations are owned by larger media conglomerates, and no one conglomerate can own more than 40% of all of the news stations in the US, but there's one that owns 39.9%. And they have a very conservative bent. And so even these broad national news organizations can be used in some sense to produce particular political viewpoints. And we see as we move across PBS, New York Times, Washington Post, those that embrace Christian nationalism are not going to these sources for their news. And so again, this shows how across Christian nationalism, people are going to different places for their news. So those information silos are key. So as we continue to try and make sense of January 6th, we can see a number of different elements of Christian nationalism intimately intertwined. So providing theological cover, the big lie, political violence, conspiratorial thinking, and then a fractured media landscape. All of these things were working together to create basically a fertile ground for this type of insurrection to take place. Now, this leads to two implications that I want to run through really quickly as we look towards the future of democracy in the United States, because the insurrection was an attack on democracy. And it wasn't the first, and it won't be the last. But it leads to, I think, some real threats toward democracy that are key. So the first is a redefinition of what happened on January 6th. Was it insurrection, or were those true American patriots? If we look at the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War in the United States, there's a rise of a narrative called the lost cause that ultimately, in many ways, won out in the US, where there are folks that say, well, the South, they weren't fighting to defend slavery, they were fighting to defend their autonomy, their way of life. And so it became less about enslaving people and more about they should be able to, run the show as they see fit. And something similar is happening with the insurrection in the United States. So when we gather data in February 2021, so this is 1 month after the insurrection, we asked survey respondents how strongly they agreed with the statement protesters should be caught and prosecuted, talking about those at the Capitol. And you can see a majority of all groups across the different measures of Christian nationalism agreed that protesters should be caught and prosecuted. A bit lower for accommodators and ambassadors, right, 75%, but again, a majority. Now, when we asked this exact same group of people 6 months later in August, this exact same question, we see that over those 6 months, accommodators and ambassadors were less likely to agree that protesters should be caught and prosecuted. So something was happening with that narrative in those 6 months where those that embrace Christian nationalism are less likely to say that those at the insurrection actually did something worthy of prosecution. Again, it's majorities, but it's 20% decline over 6 months. And this is just within 2021. And of course, this is intertwined with some of the elements we just talked about, particularly the fractured media landscape, because we had large media organizations like Fox News and even those further right from them, basically sending narratives right out into the American public that, again, questioning, was the insurrection, was it actually people that were Trump supporters? Were they really that bad? All of these things. So we see that it had an effect. And so there's a redefinition of what happened taking place there. Another quick data that we asked was, I stand with protesters who stormed the Capitol. Again, minorities of all groups. But when we asked them in February, 1 month after, and we asked it 6 months later, you can see accommodators and ambassadors are more likely 6 months later to say, I actually support those at the Capitol. Now it's 25% of ambassadors, which isn't a lot. But if we look across the American public, that would extrapolate to millions of Americans. And that, again, these are highly involved people in a political process, signifies a real danger towards democracy. Now, the last thing that I want to highlight really quickly to wrap up is another implication, and that's voter suppression. So the insurrection happened because they felt like the election was being stolen from them. But what if they were able to game the system in such a way that the election outcome wasn't in doubt? Then they don't have to attack the Capitol. And that is what we see taking place. Christian nationalism is intimately intertwined with voter suppression. Now, Paul Weyrich, who this is a screen grab of a YouTube clip, he was one of the architects of the religious right in the United States, which was a really powerful political religious movement in the 70s and 80s that really tried to bring conservative religious folks into the Republican Party and the political right. And he was saying then, in 1980, that Christians have what he calls a goo-goo syndrome, good government. They want everybody to vote. And he said explicitly to a group of pastors, I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. So again, a very explicit anti-democratic value that we want the right type of people to vote is what he's saying. And that's been true. Again, he isn't wrong in the history of the US. It's a relatively new democracy, right? In the 60s, finally, everybody essentially could vote. That's being rolled back. Now, when we look at various statements on voting issues, like we make it too easy to vote, voter fraud is getting rampant, I would support a law requiring Americans to pass basic civics tests to vote. I would support a law revoking the voting rights of certain criminal offenders for life. We can see linear relationships with Christian nationalism and these different views of essentially voter suppression, especially those last two, a civics test to vote or revoking the voting rights. These really resonate with some Jim Crow voting laws from the 1960s and before in the South that essentially disenfranchised most African Americans from the political process. And so we see that Christian nationalism, again, is intertwined with this desire to not see voting as a right of Americans, but as a privilege. And if it's a privilege, it can be taken away. And it's taken away from those Americans that they feel aren't true Americans, and they get to define who that is. And so again, with voter suppression, that's a very real long game threat to democracy in the US. And these are just two other last questions where we see ambassadors of Christian nationalism and accommodators are less likely to believe that voter suppression exists, or that gerrymandering, which again is this desire to make sure that people are elected with a very particular geographic collection of people, we need to address that to ensure fair congressional elections. All right, so I know this was a lot of graphs, but again, to just kind of highlight the story, when we look at democracy in the US, the political violence that we saw on January 6th really is due to Christian nationalism being one of the key stories, not the only key story, but one of the key stories, providing political cover, theological cover for those groups. And then again, the elements of the big lie, political violence and a comfort with it, conspiratorial thinking and a fractured media landscape, then the implications moving forward from those things highlight not only voter suppression ongoing, but a redefinition of what political violence even is and means in the US. And that for some who embrace Christian nationalism, political violence is could be a necessary step to take in order to defend their country. And if it means setting aside democracy, they're fine with that. Because as I kind of write in my next book, Christian nationalism is not interested in a country by the people for the people, this kind of American ideal, but by a particular people or a particular people. And if it means setting aside democracy, they're more than willing to do that. All right, so that I will stop with that. I look forward to some discussion. Thank you for the invitation. And yeah, really look forward to being able to talk.